Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to NUPI. My name is Morten Bøås. I'm a research professor here at NUPI, and my only task at this first of two force-bills, which leads up to our the larger conference that starts on Thursday. Here my role is just to welcome you to NUPI. NUPI is together with CMI hosting this tax cap dev network that is funded by the Norwegian Research Council, and we would like to acknowledge that funding, and we are very happy about it. And as you will see, I mean, this has become a very lively network that comprise both Norwegian researchers, researchers in the UK, in Europe, in the US, but also increasingly a number of researchers from Africa, from the Middle East, and elsewhere. And we are particularly happy about that collaboration. Here we are to launch a new book, a book that has been co-authored by Mick Moore, Wilson Pritchard, and Odd Helge Fjelstad, Taxing Africa. And right now, the only thing I'm going to do is to introduce the chair, Sigrid, who is the head of Tax Justice Network Norway, who will take us through this event, and she will also introduce the participants. So, Sigrid, the floor is yours.
Oh, now I have mine. Thank you, Morten. My first task is to tell you all that this event will be live streamed on NUPI's web pages, so behave. And I'm very enthusiastic about being the chair of this event. I'm in general extremely enthusiastic whenever a book comes along on my favorite topic of tax, the most important topic in the world. And especially when it's written in such an accessible way. So this is not a book for tax experts alone. And particularly, this book has a quite wide importance because we are in the wake of globalization. Markets and taxes are conceived as very global issues, and they have become very much global issues. But many challenges, tax challenges, are very nation-specific, and when building functioning tax systems, it requires quite a large level of trust between those who are paying the taxes and those who collect them, and this trust is built nationally. So I think this book brings about and tells the more broader story of tax, and written in such a way that it brings down the barriers to a broader tax engagement amongst citizens. So that was my little speech. And now I'm just going to briefly introduce the authors of the book. After that, two of the authors are here and will say some words, and we also have a discussant. And after that, we will open up for questions. So just note down all your comments as they speak. So, the three distinguished authors of the book, Taxing Africa. First of all, Professor Mick Moore. He is a political economist at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex. Professor Moore has a research interest in taxation and the domestic and international dimensions of good and bad governance in poor countries. He has done extensive field research in Asia and Africa and has published a number of renowned development journals and have written many books. He is also the founding CEO of the International Center for Tax and Development. Welcome, Mick. And then we have Professor Odd Helge Fjelstad. He is an economist with more than 30 years experience from research and policy analysis in Eastern and Southern Africa. His work has involved long-term collaboration with research institutions in Angola, Namibia, South Africa, Tanzania, Uganda, and Zambia. He focuses on fiscal reforms, governance, and the economics of corruption. He's also a senior researcher at Christian Michelson's Institute and an extraordinary professor at the African Tax Institute in Pretoria. He's also a senior fellow of the International Center for Tax and Development, and his works have been published in a number of renowned development journal articles, and has also written books in taxation and fiscal capacity. And Mr. Wilson Pritchard, the last one, is an associate professor at the Department of Political Science and the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. He's also a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex and is the research director of International Centre for Tax and Development. His broad research focus is in international development and in the areas of taxation, government revenues, and state building and accountability and aid reforms, with a particular focus on sub-Saharan Africa. He has an interdisciplinary background in comparative politics, international economy, and economics. And then our discussant for today, Mr. Arvind Gadgil, sitting here in front. He is currently a senior advisor at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, responsible for the Norwegian government's work on domestic resource mobilization in international development policy. He has previously been Deputy Minister for International Development and was instrumental in initiating the Norwegian Tax for Development program in 2011. So then I will invite Mick Moore to the stage and give a general description of the book and its background. So welcome, Mick.
Thank you, Sigrid. I'm going to have to start with an apology. Now, the Norwegians among you know that this is among the most honest countries in the world. If any of you don't know that, let me explain that research shows that if you randomly drop wallets with $50 notes in around streets in many countries in the world, a higher proportion of those will be handed into the police with the $50 in Norway, and I think equally in Sweden than any other country in the world. So we have a very honest country, but I'm afraid this book might be slightly guilty of corrupting the nation, because when it was published, Odd Helge was sent 3 copies to the Christian Michelsen Institute. So he put 1 copy out on display in the Christian Michelsen Institute library, and it disappeared almost immediately. So he put another copy out, and it also disappeared almost immediately. So sorry to the nation. This was an unintended side effect of that. But for those who want the book, it will be available at a greatly reduced price later over here, 100 kroner, which is a deal. We could just get a check whether we actually, how many people pay the 100 kroner and see whether the level of honesty in Oslo is greater than that in Bergen. First thing I want to say about this book is that this is not a book written for policymakers. We're not saying this is what should be done in Africa. I mean, this was an attempt to explain tax as we understood it. I suppose I could be pretentious and say to educate people. But of course, we have our opinions and we have our preferences and we have our prejudices. And so there are implicit policy messages, some quite explicit policy messages that are in the book. What I'm going to do, I mean, I'm quite keen to hear what Arvind has to say about the book. So I'm not going to give you any detail. I'm just going to list about 5 points that I think are sort of, for me, important issues that are discussed in the book and in one way or another. First point I start with is that if you look at the information we have on quality of tax administration, you can be slightly pleased, in fact, that Africa does relatively well in a global scale, and in many measures actually does rather better than South Asia or Latin America. And I think this is important because we still live in a world where people assume Africa equals problems, and especially problems with public institutions. Well, at that sort of relatively technical level, Africa does relatively well and is gradually doing better. So there is quite a positive first story there. The second point is almost the opposite of that. And in summary, I'm going to be very brief about this, there are almost 2 worlds of taxation in Africa. It's not actually 2 worlds, there's a long continuum, but I'll explain it as 2 worlds. There is the official world of ministries of finance and revenue agencies that collect pretty much the same kind of taxes as you do in Norway, not very different, using techniques that are often not terribly different from in Norway. That's one world, but the world of taxation from the point of view of most ordinary people in Africa is actually another world entirely. It's not a world of engagement with a central revenue authority. It's a world of engagement either with local government or with many kinds of non-state actors, sometimes armed non-state actors, who collect things which are objectively taxes. Whether or not they're legally taxes, they are objectively taxes. And that second world is a very problematic world in many respects. It's a good world in some ways. There's a lot of useful, informal, non-state activity, but there's also a great deal of coercion. And there is also a great deal of regressivity. That high level of dependence on local informal taxes means that poor people, as far as we know from limited research, do bear a rather heavy burden, tax burden in Africa, and a heavier burden than you would see from looking at official statistics. The third point I want to make is that the gender dimensions of taxation in Africa are both important but incredibly complex. And it would not be possible to stand and say, well, these are the gender issues in tax in Africa. There are a wide range of issues. Probably the most important single area where there's a gender dimension is the taxation of small-scale business and trade, where women are often very frequently engaged. But I don't think we can even say simply that women traders or women in business tend to be treated worse or better than men. It's a rather complicated picture and one that deserves a great deal of research. The fourth point is very simple. By far the biggest revenue gap in Africa, the revenue that should be paid that isn't paid, is from the mining sector. And that is likely to become worse in the long term because mining is possibly going to become an increasingly important part of the economies of Africa. And my fifth point is, it really goes back to the question of regressivity and equality. I have sat listened in various meetings in Africa, especially with people I'm broadly going to call African elites of various kinds, and heard people say, yes, we have a big tax problem in Africa, and the tax problem lies in the informal sector. In other words, they're saying, we pay our taxes, it's those people out there that don't pay theirs. Well, it's very convenient narrative and it's false and it's very misleading. Those poor people out there pay taxes in very many ways, including the informal way that I discussed. And equally, and there is something about this in the book, wealthy people, not just wealthy, middle-class people in Africa and wealthy people grossly underpay things like even personal income taxes. So there is enormous scope for getting a fairer contribution in tax raising from wealthy people in Africa, and frankly, not that much scope for raising more money from poor people who already do pay at least their fair share. I'll stop there and
and then I would like to invite Odd Helge, who will link tax with the Sustainable Development Goals.
It's said that taxation is the price we pay for a civilized society, but it is necessarily not that simple. As also Mick indicated here, that it very much depends on where taxes come from, how they are collected, and how tax revenues are spent. And these are some of the issues we address in the book. The book can be read from a number of perspectives. The role of African policymakers, the role of civil society in influencing tax policy or raising new issues. It can be read also from a donor perspective. But I thought one perspective which I find also relevant in this context is also to link some of the issues we have addressed in the book to the Sustainable Development Goals. as you know, the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, they were developed by the United Nations for Agenda 2030. And we know that it is a dramatically underfunded, highly ambitious task. And it is obvious that development aid cannot and has probably never been intended to be the full financer here. It is to achieve the the SDGs goals. One is dependent on massive mobilization of domestic revenue sources, mainly from taxes. And but the financial issue is the financing issue is just one of three main arguments for strengthening the tax systems in Africa. The finance, in addition to the financing argument, we have also the spending, that taxation can also have impacts on the ways the money are spent, and also it can be a catalyst for improved governance and state building. I think it's important also to state from the very start that in aggregate, the bulk of the revenues generated by African governments come from taxation. It is several years ago, aid represented a higher revenue source than taxation. Of course, there are big differences between countries. There are countries which does not generate much. They are still dependent on life support from the outside. But in aggregate, taxation is domestic taxation is the main revenue source for African countries. And the financing argument is, of course, essential here, given that the ambitions, also the Sustainable Development Goals, has. In addition, the second argument is that taxation may also support increased spending in social sectors. There are a number of studies, and also which are referred to in the book, which find a positive correlation between tax revenues from non-resource sectors and spending on health, education, and social protection. For instance, a recent study from the USAID estimates that a 10% increase in non-resource taxes leads to a 17% increase in health expenditure in low-income countries. And here are some graphs, these are correlations, but just illustrating the point here. And the social sectors, they also tend to benefit more from additional non-resource taxation than sectors like defense, for instance. Then the third argument, which we also emphasize in the book, is that taxation can be a catalyst for improved governance and state building. And we argue that bargaining our taxes is essential to building relations of accountability between the state and citizens based on mutual rights and obligations. So if taxation is undertaken in a way that promotes greater responsiveness and accountability alongside improvements in the state's institutional capacity, then tax reform can become a catalyst for broader improvements in governance. This is build the samfunnskontrakten, the social fiscal contract. So the point here, which we also emphasize in the book, is that taxation is important as a financing source, but it's also extremely important in the state-building governance perspective. Yeah, here are also some other correlations. Positive correlation between tax in the percentage of GDP, control of corruption, voice and accountability, and so on. I will not dwell much more about that. So what are the opportunities and challenges to raise more tax revenues? There has been a very strong focus in recent years on international taxation and the tax avoidance by multinational companies, which is fair and reasonable. We know that there are huge amounts of revenues which are flowing out of Africa, ending up in tax havens in London, in New York, in Switzerland, in Singapore, in the Cayman Islands, and so on. And but there is also a kind of perception often that fixing the international tax system, that is the clue. That will then solve all the problems related to the financing of the SDGs. And there are no shortage of international initiatives now to address the challenges with international tax avoidance and capital flight, since these are not specific African arguments, African challenges, but challenges which faces all countries, including Norway and the OECD countries. This has been taken over by the OECD to run the international efforts to curb these challenges. In many ways, African countries has been sidelined. They are invited to the table, but very often are not having a real influence on the processes. And many of the initiatives are designed purely for OECD countries, which have a much stronger, higher, better capacity to address this issue. Although we see that they, countries like Switzerland, like Germany and France and others, have big problems now with massive tax avoidance by large companies and fraud, including the last CumEx files, which was revealed just a month ago. And we devote 2 chapters in the book to address these issues related to international taxation and how African countries also are involved in the process or to some extent sidelined, conceptualizing the issues. As Mick also mentioned, the damage to African tax system, which are due to multinational companies' tax avoidance and evasion, that's not the only challenge here. Many African wealthy people, and there are an increasing number of billionaires in Africa, they pay hardly any tax. They use very much the same systems to hide their wealth in offshore tax havens. For instance, the Swiss leaks in 2015 revealed that almost 5,000 of the clients in the Swiss bank HSBC from 41 sub-Saharan African countries held over $6.5 billion in these accounts. Of course, there are good reasons, many good reasons to continue to focus on international tax issues. And this work will mainly be driven by the OECD. Hopefully, African countries will become more engaged, involved, so these efforts can also be designed in a way which are manageable for African countries. But there is a risk that the strong emphasis one has had on international tax evasion and avoidance has pulled attention away from the more basic, but perhaps more important work of building domestic tax systems. And in aggregate revenue terms, it is difficult to avoid the conclusion that the largest underutilized revenue sources are domestic. This is something we have addressed also in the book. So how can African countries raise more revenues? Here we devote a substantial part of the book to this discussion. There are firstly a number of underexploited revenue sources with a very high revenue potential, which of course if one are to exploit these sources, it requires political will and also a strong organizational efforts. But and it should also be acknowledged that Africa is not a country. It's 54 different countries, and challenges are different, and there are also different opportunities how to intervene and implement and design policies. But for instance, when it comes, as Mick mentioned already, the mining taxation is is a big challenge. It is severely underexploited. That doesn't mean that some countries generate substantial revenues from mining, but the general picture is that the mining sector is a big challenge when it comes to generating revenues for government. There are also massive tax exemptions granted by African governments to both foreign and domestic investors, which undermines the tax base and the fairness of the tax system. In some countries, in East Africa, Tanzania, for instance, the lost revenues due to tax exemptions, which generate very little, attract very few investors, may represent up to 4% of GDP. And then, as Mick mentioned, the wealthy elites are very rarely taxed, and this has severe impacts on fairness and equity. It's common that in African countries, less than 5% of the population pay personal income tax. In OECD countries, we are talking about up to more than 50%. And a study which ICTD did recently in Uganda found that only 5% of company directors in Uganda remitted any personal income tax. And there are also ineffective taxation of fossil fuels, low and ineffective taxation of tobacco, alcohol, which impacts on both revenues and health. And there are also, the property tax regime is very exploited in spite of the hyper-urbanization we observe. Second, improving tax policies. The key thing here is simplification of tax laws, regulations, and rate structures. And many countries in Africa have gone a long way to improve their tax policies. What we observe today of the tax policy regimes is completely different than it was 20, 30 years ago when we started to work on this. But much remains to be done with the tax legislation and licensing of natural resources. There are general weaknesses related to unpredictable and inconsistent legislation, tax exemptions already mentioned, and the subnational tax system is very much ignored. Many of the reforms are focused on the national tax regime, very little on the subnational. And there is also very poor coordination between national, subnational governance when it comes to taxation. Someone experienced in a number of countries double taxation or inconsistencies between different levels. And then when it comes to administration, a main challenge there is that there are a lot of collection of data, but data are hardly analyzed and very rarely shared within a within departments in a revenue administration. And IT systems very often do not communicate with each other. There is now an increasing focus on e-governance and digitalization, which is important. At the national level, one has introduced cashless payment, for instance, but still there are big challenges with making these systems communicate. And corruption is still a challenge in a number of countries. Some years ago, President Museveni in Uganda referred to Uganda Revenue Authority as a den of thieves. But this of course has developed. There have been changes there. South Africa Revenue Services is a sad story from one of world-class tax administration, which was started up in '97. In 2014, it was taken over by one of Zuma's cronies and destroyed within 2 years. And there is, of course, a need for much better connection between tax payment and public services. Earmarking might be an issue. It's not the first best solution of how revenue should be spent, but it might be a word. But there are also risks, and now I'm almost there, Sigrid. What are the risks of targeting more taxes? Well, firstly, we know that taxes can have negative impact on private investors if they are overtaxed. And we see we have experienced, and it's also documented in the book, that in particular at the small, when it comes to small and micro enterprises, all these nuisance taxes, partly informal taxes, have a huge negative impact on the development of the businesses. And then we have also, in particular at the subnational levels, we see the tax system can be very predatory and divisive. And of course, finally, the benefits of taxation depend on how the money are used. So the key message for the book is that the overall challenge for African tax countries is not only to tax more, but to tax better, to tax more consistent, to tax more transparent, fair, predictable, efficient, and honest. That is the concluding words before the quiz. Was it Mick who said this? It could be. Or Sigrid. I'm not sure about you, Fredrik, whether you could have said that. Keynes. Any suggestion? Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Odd Helge. And now, Mr. Arvid Gadgil, you have read the book and you might have some comments. So 10 minutes for your comments.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. And the first thing to say is, of course, congratulations. It is, and this price is ridiculous. I just have to tell you, it's an absolutely ridiculous price. Please make use of it and buy yourself a book and make sure that it's under as many Christmas trees as possible this Christmas, because it's worth it. Let me just first say the timing of this is very much is excellent. No, first of all, today is a wonderful day for Norway, because it's today that the transparency of the Norwegian tax system is in full bloom. It's today that we get the numbers of the aggregated numbers, the tax numbers of every single taxpayer in Norway available for everyone to see. It is a fantastic thing, and I think it's unrivaled in terms of transparency around the world. We should be proud of this, very, very proud of this. And the second thing, just to mention for my own sake, perhaps, is the fact that today is Diwali, one of the largest religious festivals in the world. More than 1 billion people celebrate it, and it's a festival which marks the success of good over evil, the start of a new year, the start of new thoughts and ideas towards prosperity. So in many ways, this book fits both in a religious setting and in a very pragmatic tax technical setting. So I have many reasons to be grateful to the authors for this book. One that I just have to mention is that I actually, for the first time in many years, been able to read a book from the beginning to the end. This is a chronic illness that I have because I am a father of 2 small children. It's almost impossible to read an entire book, but this time I was able to. But the second is, of course, that I can justify reading this in my working hours, because it's not only, well, as you say, it's not a prescriptive book for policymakers necessarily, but it's a book that gives a lot of depth to the key policy questions that we have to handle. So in that way, it's been an extraordinary journey for me to read this book, and I'll say a little bit about why. First, let me just say 2 things about key impressions, about the way that they have attacked the material and collated it into these, what is it, 8 chapters, 7 chapters. I think the first thing to say is, as Mick also was saying, it's principally not a technocratic book. It's not a book that makes use of diagrams or of econometric models or the standard economics tools to understand taxation. It is first and foremost a book that looks at the actors, looks at how do actors relate to the flawed or an unflawed system of taxation, the complicated dynamic between these actors. And in that way, actually, the book, I was thinking about it this morning, it's less of an economic social science book, and more of sort of you could include it in the sort of larger umbrella of behavioral social science. Because what it really does is it tries to poke underneath the surface and understand what are the sort of hidden dynamics that decides whether or not tax bargains are healthy or not, to what extent the tax system is extortionate or not. So that's the first sort of conclusion takeaway for me, is that it's quite unique in that sense, that a relatively technical but yet not technocratic book is still focused on behavioral patterns and incentive structures, although they don't use any of those words, to explain the relationship, complicated relationship between taxpayers and authorities and the international system. And that brings me to the second part of, a key takeaway from this book is the fact that it's possible to write this book, to join this many analytical levels or levels of planes of analysis. They start off saying that it's important to bring together international, national, and local levels for understanding the totality of the tax system. But I think, in a way, it takes you through this journey, from being an eagle soaring above this landscape of history, trying to understand why is it that the tax system in Africa very often is seen as first and foremost a form of extortion, and then sort of dives down into a slow, turtle-eyed view on the intimate connections between the tax system and the female vendor on the market. How does that relationship work? And then again soars up like an eagle and tries to look at the international tax system and how that connects to all of this, and then down again to these issues of how does the bureaucracy of tax work. To what extent is reforming tax systems actually viable instruments to reform the entire government apparatus? It is a unique journey from that very high level analytical sort of eagle eyes view to that lower level intimate and slow attempt at understanding these very complex dynamics at a much more local level. So these two things makes it a unique book. Now I just want to say a little bit about why I think it's an important book. Two different things. It's an important book for two main reasons for me. The first is, and I have to take a detour an argument detour to get to my point. There is an extraordinary and unexpected consensus forming around the issue of taxation globally today. I say unexpected because I think it's been really quick. I don't think people have actually, realized how fast, how quickly we've reached this spot, this space. And my sudden eureka moment came in March this year when the Norwegian Parliament was discussing tax as a part of development policy. There was a question posed to the Minister for International Development, to what extent is tax an important part of Norwegian international development policy? And the 1.5-hour ensuing debate was absolutely fascinating. I wouldn't call it extreme left, don't have those in Norway, but the radical left to the radical right rallied around exactly the same talking points, which is that this is important, we cannot do without it, we need to do it better, and we need to do it more. It is no longer a leftist type agenda, it is an entirely consensus-based agenda that is completely bought into by all kinds of ideologies. And that's important to remember. And it's important, and that's what makes this book important, is because this is not just this small period of history where this development policy fashion is to talk about tax. No, I think that debate told me quite clearly that this is here to stay. There's no reason to think that tax policy issues in international development policy making is going to be less important. I think there's every reason to think that it's going to be much more important. And the second reason why this book is important is because I remember very clearly when we sort of started designing the Tax for Development program in 2010 and then launched it in 2011, including money for tax cap dev. One of the key things that we at that time discussed, well, one of the things that I realize now is that we didn't actually discuss it. We simply accepted the following logical conclusion. There's not enough money, we need to raise the money, let's use taxes to raise the money, and we will save the world. We didn't actually properly understand what that meant. now, when we travel around the world, Frederick and other colleagues of mine, to try to and Olav not least, try to engage in these tax policy discussions, it's no longer a viable argument to simply say, raise your taxes, you get more money, and the poverty is gone. It's just too simplistic. It's too naive to take that type of worldview. It's not possible anymore to further that point of view because it's just simply uninteresting. But now, this field of taxation has matured to the point that you need to put forward nuanced agreements or arguments. You need to explain why and how, as this book so clearly spells out in the beginning and the end. It's no longer, the question is no longer if you need to increase tax income for many developing countries. It's just how you do it, which is important, and that's where the real difficulties are. Finding the right recipe for this and the right sequence of policy decisions. So that's the second reason why it's important. It's just simply that this field has become so mature now that you cannot walk into any debate or a discussion on tax and international development using the old truisms. For example, there are many variations of these truisms. The one is that in the 80s the pushing of the VAT regime as the savior of all problems is no longer the case necessarily. And another question is, to what extent is VAT progressive or not, which is a very complicated question, while the sort of truism answer to that is that it is regressive. That's not necessarily the case, and this is one of the things that the book actually explains, why that is not necessarily the case. So these truisms, even within this relatively limited field of tax and international development, are being challenged, and rightly so. They need to be challenged, otherwise we're going to make a huge number of mistakes in the years to come, because this consensus and the fact that this field has matured as much as it has done, and because, as what Helge was talking about, the Sustainable Development Goals are just intimately dependent on tax income, donors like the one that I'm representing are going to spend a lot more money on this, and we are going to make a number of mistakes. We're going to stumble over each other, and we're going to make policy advice in many different directions. And the one at this point in time, I don't see that it's a coherent enough understanding of how specific the challenges are in the countries that we work, that we are able to ensure success in all our action. And therefore, it's just so important that we have a book, and much more to come, I'm sure, about nuancing these already established truths about how to engage on tax issues. I didn't really, criticize anything yet. I think I hope that we can get into that a little later. I do have some points that I would hope to hear your views on, but I talked to a friend of mine who's co-authoring a book with someone else, naturally, and he was saying that remember, co-authoring a book is much more difficult than having a happy marriage for 50 years. Because co-authoring a book, you get so intimately into each other's thoughts that you are bound to find disagreements and challenges with each other's takeoff points and perspective. And I just cannot wait to hear if the two of you, it's a strange marriage, but the three of you, it would be interesting to hear all three of you, but at least the two of you, to what issues and what areas were there some substantial discussions on what sort of takeoff point or what sort of conclusions there should be. And finally, my final point is, you open the book by saying this is not a prescriptive book. In fact, I counted something like 28 prescriptions. It's just completely inconsistent. And I'm just eager to understand why that's the case. I'm very happy you did, but I'm eager to understand why that happened. Was it, did it have to happen that you ended up with prescriptions even though you said you wouldn't do that? But it's an interesting thing to understand better. Well, thank you very much.
Right, so thank you. And I would like all three of you now to come up on stage. And yeah, I was a bit nervous that you said you were saving your critique, so there was nothing for them to kind of answer right now. But you did pose some questions. more on the sordid details of the of maybe the disagreements that have come along the way during the book, or how you resolved them, and if there were any. And I don't know if you want to comment on some of the last points have been raised here.
Have we ever disagreed? Or
I don't think so. Why should we?
Now, of course, one thing is, well, we have different experiences. Will Pritchard, he has done a lot of work in West Africa, Sierra Leone, Ghana, and so on. I done a lot in Southern Africa. Mick has also done in East Africa and some, and also a more difficult country up in Somaliland and so on. And we bring our experience with us. That's often our reference points. And it is experiences from Sierra Leone, maybe different from Tanzania. And then you try to push your argument, and you have to you are confronted with the counter arguments and so on. But what we found, okay, there are, well, countries are different. There are different experiences. But what we have brought into the this co-authorship is a part of the puzzle, which we then try to put together. And I think we managed that fairly well. But that was an issue. We spent quite a lot of time on that, and I think we had some heavy discussions around it. But I think we managed. Still friends. Yeah.
I mean, let me just say, you know, Odd and I have been working and writing together for a very long time now. We started off in two completely opposite ends of the spectrum here. I was the great enthusiast for tax and tax and tax again, and Odd had made his name by doing research in Tanzania in particular on the dysfunctions of taxation systems and the problems of taxation. So we did start very much at the opposite ends, and somehow we seem to have reached a sort of soggy middle. Yeah. But no, I don't think actually we had any great, enormous disputes about any of these issues.
What about these prescriptions that keep popping up? They might not be that explicit, but they're there. You may not call them prescriptions, but you call them advice, or you call them or possible solutions. I mean, it's interesting that you end up actually suggesting this many ways forward when your ambition clearly was not to.
Take it, or shall I start?
No, go on.
Of course, we may not call it prescriptions. You read it like that. And this is, of course, a reflection on how we works. We are applied, policy-oriented researchers. And that also implies that part of the work we do is when we've done research, it's gone through all these processes with peer reviewing and so on, then we have also an ambition that our work shall have some impact, that we shall also come up with some advice. We don't say that, okay, this you should do this, but this is a possible approach if you want to improve the system. I don't think we come up with the very technocratic ways of doing things, but we say, okay, there are challenges here. For instance, with respect to the VAT, which we find it is problematic just to say that this is a tax which you mentioned is perceived to be highly regressive. When we go dig into it, we see no regressive relative to what? Not regressive relative to the taxes they VAT replaced, for instance. And also very many of the foodstuffs and goods poor people are consuming are exempted or zero rated. So here, I don't think that's a prescription, but I think that is a kind of a way we want to also contribute to a kind of a public education on these issues. But what you might define as a kind of a prescription, using your word here, with respect to VAT, is that say it's unrealistic to abolish VAT. VAT is there to stay in those countries which it has been implemented. So the key issue is how to improve it, how to make it better, how to address the shortfalls. That, I think, is our way of communicating the findings and knowledge and insights also.
I think it's time to now let the floor ask questions, and there's a microphone running around. So I will take 3 or 4 questions in one go, and please, when you please be short. Say your name and if relevant, where you work or your affiliations. First from here.
My name is Jens Anvik, and I've noted that Nick has stolen Odd Helge from my field. So we have done work together on police corruption in Africa. I have 2 kind of observations. I haven't read the books, but there are 2 things that I've been thinking about when it comes to taxation in African countries. The first is that due to international kind of actions, there have been restraints on import taxes, and I've observed, for example, in Ivory Coast, that when the import taxes went down, the kind of charges on paperwork increased, and part of this charges increased. When that happened, was the Bureau Veritas took higher charges, and that meant it went in a small way. Some of it went out, but the trade, the harbors are an extremely sensitive and difficult area to control, and it's a place where taxes and police corruption or custom corruptions goes very close. The second kind of thing in it that is also a kind of, it's also not a scientific observation, but I have been struck by the fact, or not the fact, but the impression gained from Kenyan newspapers that due to the fairly efficient tax administration in Kenya, it was possible to get cheap international commercial loans compared to what you could expect. And that the kind of income from that, those bonds went partly to finance electoral competition as before. So that is another way, the kind of pessimistic way to look at the efficient tax administration when it's done in a certain context. Yeah, thank you.
And second question over here, 3rd row.
My name is Arista Guerra. I am a senior researcher at the Pole Institute based in Igoma in DRC Congo. I was very interested in one small sentence where you said that taxes are possible when you know how money is being used. And I think this is a key phrase, because I live on the border with Rwanda, and I happen to be one of the more than 10,000 people, families from Congo living in Gisenyi on the border. In Congo, I have a lot of problem to pay taxes myself. I remember one day when tax people came to my office and they want to raise taxes, and I said, okay, listen, I have a problem. My father was a teacher for 33 years, paying taxes every month. When he died, my mom never got even a single dollar from them. And for me, if taxes are not something you can see back, it is a problem. And my problem within Congo, I found the opposite in Rwanda, where, for instance, I have no problem. people have no problem to pay taxes because they see that taxes which are being collected are used properly in a country in terms of public services, etc. So you can see this difference. And then there was recently another technical kind of taxation raising, which Rwanda and Tanzania tried on Rusumo frontier. They managed to have one kind of desk to collect taxes for both countries. And on the Tanzanian side, and this was in the mouth of the president himself, taxes were increased 1,000%, 1,000%, because they were sharing this kind of technical way of raising taxes and collecting them with Rwanda. So, well, it is not just a technical problem, but also I think it is a mindset problem. Why is it that some people are ready to pay and some others cannot pay, and how to go about it?
Third one here in the front.
Thank you very much. My name is Innocency. I come from Mozambique, civil society organization. I want to make 3 comments. The first one is about the capacity to control the system. My focus is in the extractive industry. A lot of studies and research shows that the companies in the extractive industry is not paying enough. It's not paying what it's supposed to pay. And part of it is due to the fact that there is no capacity to control from the side of the government to control these issues. And I don't know if you, the authors of the book, talked about it in your book. And when the government try to increase their capacity, sometimes they have to engage with the companies, and it creates other problem, that is the conflict of interest, because most of the time the companies have to pay. For example, if the ruby mining company goes to Singapore to sell the rubies, they take and they pay the tickets to the government to fly to them, and it can create like fear to control. Not only fear, like the government feels like, how can we control someone that is paying my ticket? I don't know if I was clear. The second point is about the tax exemptions. In the extractive industry, a lot of companies have exemptions to, for example, in the first 5 or 10 years, they don't need to pay 50% of the corporate tax, for example. And how to raise, in this case, how to raise the revenues, how to raise the resources. My last point is about the management. Even if the government or even if the country increase the resources, increase the revenues, the focal point is how to manage it. I will give you the example that is happening here now in Mozambique. The government decide to use 5% of the future revenues that will come from gas exploration to pay the creditors in the contest of the debt. And okay, this is another point. So even if the country have this capacity to increase the revenues, this capacity to raise the revenues, if the management approach it's not clear and it's not transparent, it will not. It's like nothing was done. Thank you.
Okay, then that was many questions. We have time for one more round, so just save your questions. Who would like to begin? Are there any of these you would particularly like to start on?
Yes. Thank you, Jens, for your observations. And I think we have still a lot of both work and at least discussion to proceed with based on what you had done before. And of course, this is the interesting cases, which would be very, very exciting to dig more into together with you. The example you gave from Goma from DRC, the difference between Rwanda and DRC is interesting. Of course, these are two different worlds when it comes to taxation. Rwanda has it's a small country. It's a country which has managed to develop a tax system since '94, which has a high degree of legitimacy also, and it's the government has been very conscious also about showing that tax revenues are spent on public services which are visible to people. Mick has done a lot of work in Rwanda and knows that setting much better than me. But we have in one of the chapters in the book, we also provide examples of this different tax world. Rwanda is one case. We could have used DRC on the other side, but we use Somaliland. They are two completely different tax worlds. And when it comes to reforms, how to address this, it's very complex in the DRC setting. But we have also examples in DRC where at the local level, local government or municipal level and provincial level, where one has managed to develop very effective property tax systems. But they have been developed without any kind of interaction with the central level. I think tomorrow we will have one presentation referring to one of these cases at the conference. The one-stop shop you mentioned between the border of Tanzania and Tanzania is very interesting. Between Tanzania and Rwanda, that is very interesting. This is the whole purpose is to simplify tax payment, to make it easy to pay, because procedures to pay taxes, as you mentioned, can be very cumbersome in many African countries. You have to visit a large number of offices and fill out all kinds of forms and so on. So I was not aware of that case. So that would be very interesting to hear more about. But at the subnational level, municipal level, both Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda have also introduced one-stop shops, they call, for paying business licenses to simplify life. If you want a business license, previously you might visit 10, 15, 20 different public offices. Now one has tried to put this into one office to simplify. And compliance is also about making it easy, simple to pay taxes. We also see in an increasing number of African countries that in particular at the national level, but also in some subnational government, that they have turned into cashless paying by using mobile phones and paying directly into the account of the revenue authority. In that way, one has also managed to reduce, to some extent, corruption. Yes, I think it's your turn, Mick, and maybe Arvin, have you something to say about the exemption story? I think here.
Something on the mindset because of the life.
Yeah.
Because when you talk about Africa, it's as if it is
Yeah.
one reality.
Yeah.
It's not.
No, there's very different. Yeah, yeah, and that is also what we see between Rwanda and DRC, for instance. Yeah, but there are some very, very interesting, important experiences. The example you gave about one-stop shop, how to simplify. That has been the trend now during the last 15, 20 years when it comes to tax legislation and administrative reforms in a number of East and Southern African countries to simplify tax payments procedure, to do taxpayer education, outreach is a key component of the key activity of many revenue authorities. How to also trying to turn people into good tax citizens, like Rwanda. They have competition every year who is the best taxpayer in the country, for instance. And it's flagged in the newspapers. In some other countries, they are doing the opposite by flagging the names of tax evaders. But very often, the positive message is better, more effective, competing to be the #1 taxpayer in the country instead of the worst tax evader.
Or Arvind, do you want to make first?
Okay, let me just take a couple of them, Sigrid. Let's go to the question of why people pay taxes. At one level, we know the answer. It's very simple. At the other level, we don't really know it at all. But at the level it's simple is, broadly speaking, there are 4 factors that explain differences between people's willingness to pay taxes. Do you think your government is legitimate? Do you think you're actually getting something in return for your taxes? Do you think that other people like you are paying taxes? And can you get away with it? I mean, by not paying. I mean, those are the sort of 4 main factors. The problem is that the importance of those factors varies very much from one context to another. But the policy issue is not that abstract question, what are the deep factors? It is what you're going to do about it. And it's clear in this case that if you're in a situation, as you are in DRC and many other countries, where taxation is extractive and people don't like to pay and they're not getting much in return, there's only one party who can do anything about that, which is the government. No one else can break that deadlock. You know, if taxpayers suddenly all decide they're going to be terribly patriotic and they'll pay their taxes anyway, that's not going to change anything. Government will just, you know, abuse your money. So it is a matter of governments doing something about that. But this is the sort of standard chicken and egg problem. You know, how do you get enough revenue to start giving people something in return so that they will pay? I mean, like many chicken and egg problems, it sounds very difficult in the abstract, but it's actually not quite so difficult in practice. You could do it if you want to do it. You know, if any government in the DRC really perceived this to be a problem, we could very easily advise, you know, how you start. You just need to improve a little, and then they improve a little, and you improve a little. So it's not actually terribly challenging. The challenge is that governments often don't actually want to do this, or for various reasons find it very difficult to do this. We could talk much more about that, but let me, Innocency, you ask about extractives, but you talked about the capacity to control. Well, there's a whole chapter here on extractives. And my view would be, I would be a little skeptical of your story that the problem in Mozambique is that the government doesn't have the capacity to control extractive companies. I would suggest, if Mozambique is like many other countries in the world, not just in Africa, the problem is that enough people in government have been paid off that they don't wish to put too much effort into controlling extractive companies. And that, to me, is the central problem with extractives, and especially mining, is that, for a whole range of reasons that are discussed in the chapter, it is so easy to reach an equilibrium situation where companies avoid taxes, people in positions of power get paid off quite generously to allow them to do that, and the public treasury that funds health and education gets nothing. I mean, and that's the real, and it's a very, very difficult challenge. I mean, mining in Africa is the most difficult taxation area in the world. It's really hard to know what to do about this. And we can, again, there are lots of particular technical suggestions we can have about this. But until there is some sense that you're going to have a political deal that ends up with some benefit for the public treasury and taxpayers, as opposed to just mining companies and just people in power, we have very real problems.
Arvind, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to, it's not actually a response to any other questions, but it's a little bit to this discussion. When the first one on extract, one of the excellent things about this book is that it doesn't focus so much on extractive industries. And I think the reason why I say this might be a bit provocative is because that's been the focus when it comes to revenue generation in the economy and developing countries now for at least since before 2003, when EITI was established, so Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. And we may not have made that much, inroads into the problem, but I think it's the important value addition of this book is not that chapter. You know, that chapter in itself is a very interesting one because I suspect you may have written it, but it does explain why the mining sector must be treated very differently and understood very differently from, for example, the oil and gas sector. These are very different attributes to these sectors that requires different responses from authorities. But I just wanted to say another thing that I think and this discussion and these questions perhaps reflect that this book also adds another very brave lens to look at the totality of the tax burden for inhabitants, and that's this concept of small taxes. And I'd like you to say a little bit more about that, because I think we need to really focus on this. In fact, that's where you get a bit prescriptive and you start to discuss, how do you actually start reforming the small taxes, being both the formal taxes and the informal taxes. That are small in the sense that they're locally enforced and collected. And I think that the numbers coming up in this book about how incredibly extractive they are in nature, some of these, how much they lack in legitimacy and therefore also reflect badly on the legitimacy of centrally imposed taxes, and how that basically is the starting point of the inside-out crumbling of a meaningful tax bargaining in any society. And that's this concept of small taxes. While we have this feeling that we need to focus on the big money, which is important, of course, but this book shows so clearly that if we focus on the big money only, we lose perhaps the most important aspects of this relationship that Helge was talking about, how to create viable, meaningful, fruitful tax bargaining relationships between citizen, local companies and authorities. So I'm completely out of line, didn't answer a single question, but anyway.
And we'll have a new round of questions. You'll get a new chance. So some more questions. Lady here first.
One of the next ones.
Thank you. My name is Laure Niassou, and I'm an experienced economist. I used to work for a peacekeeping mission in the DR Congo as an economist over there. So you mentioned the issue of tax exemption, and to me, when I was thinking about it, looking at what's happened in the DR Congo, I recall that at the time, tax exemption were obtained because you had to attract FDI. You have to attract foreign investment in the country. And then you have also, so there is not really a policy because it's one company trying to get tax exemption and so on, and it just added. But then came the game of political interference. And it is very difficult once you start giving tax exemption to remove that, because we can get out of power, and we are in Africa, so it's another game.
Thank you. My name is James Shilu. I'm from the civil society organization in Liberia called Platform for Dialogue and Peace. Thank you for such a very brilliant topic in the book. Just one question. You outline 4 topologies for tax. Talk about legitimacy and if you can get away, and the next 2 other ones you indicated. I'm very concerned about the issue of tax that sometimes I pay by multinational companies to sometimes leaders who are not really legitimate, but it's being done to protect their personal interest. When the tax supposedly supposed to be used to develop the country and benefit the entire citizenry. A specific example for me was what happened in Liberia. The American company called Firestone paid a whole lot of money to Charles Taylor when he was the so-called rebel faction leader, knowing for the war that this money was being used to import arms and kill innocent people. The question then is, where is this international responsibility when it comes to tax and companies that are legitimate from legitimate country like the US and other places allow their companies to pay taxes to these belligerent groups? That's the question. What are your book address some of these issues?
Gentleman with the...
Thank you so much. My name is Joseph. I'm a citizen of Zambia. I must be too quick to mention that I'm already in love with the book because I find the title of the book so interesting, and I'm looking forward to reading it. But I want to find out whether it is possible to have an effective tax system with increased revenues without having to heavily tax the citizens of a particular country. I ask this question because at the moment in Zambia, we the citizen, we feel like the current regime is taxing us so much, such that sometimes we even feel like they are double taxing us. Take for instance, if you want to make a phone call, you have to recharge, and from the recharge itself, there is VAT tax already that is imposed on that. And if you make a WhatsApp call, an internet phone call, you are taxed for that again. So I've been one of those that have been in a vocal fight against these heavy taxes. I think I want to be educated on that so that I could probably take a shift and look at the other direction. Thank you.
All right. So there's Arvin, since you didn't answer any questions last round, I thought it was quite interesting about this international responsibility for these multinational companies when they come into the country. And us, little Norway, we have our own giant multinational companies going around the world. And yeah, things are not always transparent and maybe going to the right people. So maybe you could comment a little bit about that.
I could defend them, is what you're saying. Well, this is, I think this, so I'm just going to try to not answer this in a very elegant way by saying this issue of company responsibility in taxation is becoming a very big issue, both when it comes to the issue of tax planning, but also, you know, just thinking of sort of non-formal taxation as taxation is, which we should think about it that way. So even if it's a group not in power, paying money to them is a form of taxation that shouldn't be, and it should be dealt with explicitly and not in a much more granular way than the international community is doing today. There are some. The reason why I'm saying I think this is going to be more and more important is only I think it's 3 months ago the Norwegian oil fund put out this expectation document on how they want the companies that they have ownership in to treat tax issues. And it's a milestone because the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world basically tells all companies that tax planning issues are to be dealt with in the boards. And this might not seem very revolutionary, but it is. The fact that these issues are being brought up, the oil fund expects the companies to deal with that in the boards means that they, to a much greater extent, have to be. You have to answer for the thousands of different choices that that people who decide where and when to pay taxes in the company makes. That is so. That's one development. Another one is just I don't know if you know this B team, which is a conglomeration or a group of international executives, which have I think to a certain extent managed to step up and say, listen, this is not only basically saying national governments are not able to regulate the international companies properly. We need to appeal to an international moral standard. Now, that doesn't always lead to anything, but I think it is a sign that this issue of international corporation and their taxation This is also to do with the tax holidays and tax exemptions, which is a very good question. None of us have really answered it. We see the tax exemptions are exploding all around the world. It's a true race to the bottom through these tax exemptions, and there are number of creative ways of getting renewed tax exemptions or tax holidays, and renaming companies and redoing lease contracts and all of these things, which and even African countries themselves are becoming extraordinarily creative on this, where economic zones are being not zones that are geographically limited, but you can give an economic zone, special economic zone status to a single company, which then again, of course, means a massive gaping hole in the tax system. So there are many people and actors you can point fingers at here, but I think the international companies are going to be under much more pressure to do something about their own legitimacy.
So if a Norwegian company got a tax exemption in an African country, and there come a new government who wants to renegotiate that one, how would the Norwegian government react?
How would the Norwegian government react?
Or the company is state-owned company, so
I think
opposed, you think?
Well, I think, and this is the dilemma here, because companies will always say, as long as they act within the law, and the law is domestic by definition, then they do nothing wrong, and they will always seek the best possible bottom line. As far as I know, this is not my field, but as far as I know, we don't put any particular expectations to Norwegian companies on how they should deal with the offer of a tax holiday. But it's a challenging issue. I think, and reputation there's power in reputation, and I think you're simply using that as a tool could lead us in the right direction. But I don't know, specifically if the Norwegian government what their reaction would be.
So we're soon running out of time, but I'd like to let you to divide the last 5 minutes between you to answer and come with some closing comments.
Yeah, now I can start again with the exemptions issue, which is a big issue, and as Arvin also argues, is that this is mushrooming now in a number of African countries, and this is happening in spite of the fact there is a big literature which documents that these exemptions have, in general, very limited effect on attracting foreign investors. What is most important for investors is predictability, political stability, access to electricity and infrastructure and such things. So when I have discussed this issue in maybe in a bar in the evening with people from these companies, they say this is just a bonus we get. We would have invested anyway. But then when you get into this kind of race to the bottom, one country offer exemptions to that company, we have to do the same. But does it make sense, for instance, that if a company in Kenya are granted exemptions, a company in agriculture are being granted tax exemptions, then Tanzanian give exemptions to a Tanzanite mining company. It's only in Tanzania they have the Tanzanite, but they are still granted exemption. So this has to do with politics around, and a lot of vested interest involved. It is a very important issue. I'm not sure whether I got the issue about the Zambia issue, where you said how to have an effective tax system without having to tax citizens. Okay, I can answer probably something completely different. I think many African countries are very rich in natural resources, both renewable and extractives. There have been a lot of focus on the extractives. I think there is a need now also to put more emphasis on how to build more effective systems in the natural resource sector in general, including fisheries and forestries and so on. But we know that countries in Africa which has relied solely on the extractive sector, Angola on oil, Nigeria on oil, ignored the development of the domestic revenue system, the non-resource sector, they are in general very poorly governed. Maybe we call it a prescription. One important message, at least, is that countries rich in natural resources should not forget the development of the broader tax system, domestic tax system. These things have to develop both. Otherwise, one become very vulnerable for price fluctuations, and also one delink this state-citizen relations, which the ordinary tax systems, direct taxes and so on, can do to facilitate more constructive tax bargaining between citizens and the government. And I think I'll stop there.
Okay, very briefly, two things, and related on Zambia. We're probably moving into a period when there's going to be quite a lot of news items about tax protests and riots in Africa, because large numbers of people now have cell phones and they're using their phones to make phone calls, they're transferring money, mobile money, they're going on the social media, and all those things government think is very taxable. Which it probably is, and I'm not sure it's in fact that so bad. It may be a good idea, but the problem is you end up taxing exactly the most vocal people who can get on their phones and contact other people very quickly. So do look out for a few tax riots. The last point I'd just say on tax exemptions also. It's no surprise we have lots of tax exemptions. The reasons we have them are enormous. Economists, especially sort of statist economists, can make clear strategic arguments why we need an industrial policy and therefore we should have tax exemptions. Governments are caught in this problem of individualism, lack of collective action, and fear that if they don't give tax exemptions, the company will go next door to the next country, even though it's often completely irrational. Companies encourage that. Politicians love tax exemptions because they get bribed to give tax exemptions, and a great way of controlling companies and making sure they keep making political payments to you, especially domestic companies, is to give them a tax exemption and make it clear that if they misbehave, they'll lose it. So, you know, plus governments love announceables everywhere. And, you know, the simplest announceable, we're going to develop some industry, I've given a tax exemption. So, you know, there are too many reasons why we have tax exemptions, and we're not going to clear them up very quickly. But, you know, if we want to do something about them, I mean, I think the best immediate policy for Africa is have either Africa-wide or regions within Africa, governments should have clear criteria for giving tax exemptions and clear procedures for application and granting of tax exemptions. Then at least we have a standard of judgment. What happens at present, as I think you know, and implicit in the question, is all too often, you know, you agree to invest in my country, and then you come along and talk to, you know, Odd, who's the Minister of Finance, and say, oh, give me a tax exemption. And Odd scribbles on a piece of paper, give this company a tax exemption. And, you know, that is about the end of the process. I mean, if we can get away from that kind of very informal process to a much more standardized, transparent, formal processes, I think we'll make a bit of progress. A bit rather than a lot, probably.
So hope for progress. That's a great way of ending. And I want to also just say that you can hear more of these three on the and myself actually at the conference. Conference tomorrow and Friday. And so if you haven't already subscribed for that conference, please do. And I don't think there's anything more for me to say than just thank you and
buy the book.
And buy the book. Christmas tree, remember? Christmas presents. And well home.